Welcome to Tangents from Coin Center. I'm Jerry Brito, and I've got Peter Van Valkenburg with me. Hi, Peter.
Hey, Jerry.
All right. So today we've got just a couple things to talk about. We're going to talk about a little bit more about FinCEN's proposed crypto rule, and
never get enough of that.
Never. But this is the podcast for people who want
more than they should.
More. And we're going to talk a little bit maybe about DeFi. So let's start with FinCEN. We got a bit more clarity this past week because FinCEN put out a notice in the Federal Register.
Notice number 3 for this rulemaking.
Correct.
Lots of notice, not much comment. Well, there's lots of comment too now.
Yeah. So this notice basically extended the comment period for the original notice of proposed rulemaking by 60 days, which is what you normally would get, at least in this kind of rulemaking. And what's interesting about this is there was a question about whether, since the rulemaking had not been finalized before the Biden administration took over, and President Biden issued a memo on day one freezing all pending rulemakings, the question was this rule frozen or not?
And a lot of people thought it was frozen and were glad that it was frozen because maybe it would just die then.
Right. And yes, I think you're right that a lot of people assumed it was frozen, and a lot of the media reported as a fact that it was frozen.
Yeah.
But I think at this point, and there's still a question: was it frozen ever? And it's kind of like a Schrodinger's cat kind of thing. Schrodinger's midnight regulation, because maybe it was frozen at a certain point, and this notice
started it up.
Pauses. Yeah. Because regulatory freezes are sort of are just typical for new administrations these days. I think the last 3 administrations that took over from a party of the opposite, president of the opposite party, have certainly done them on day one. And all it means is it's paused. The regulations are paused until the new administration can review them and decide if they want to continue them or not, or amend them or something. So,
on the other hand, you get a lot of exceptions from freezes for law enforcement and stuff with international relations, right? And so
and in this case,
on here too, right?
Well, no, I don't think so. So in the Biden memo, it specifically said that all regulations were frozen unless the agency requested otherwise in writing, citing one of these law enforcement or other exemptions, and it was approved by the White House. As far as I'm aware, none of that happened here.
Doesn't seem to have happened. Okay.
So, whether
it doesn't matter though, right?
It doesn't matter.
We're back to a 60-day comment period, which is actually on the somewhat generous side of what you'd expect from a normal rulemaking.
Yeah.
The average is 45, right? And
the average is 45. The Administrative Conference of the United States recommends 60 days.
Those guys are party animals.
I know some of the people there. So like BD, if you're listening, you definitely are a party animal. So now we have another comment period. And then what's interesting is this applies to the whole rule. If you remember from the last episode, we talked about how it was very strange how, without creating a new notice of rulemaking, they've bifurcated the rule into 2 sort of periods where you got 15 days more comment time for the CTR requirement and 45 days for the counterparty.
Anything to do with counterparty identification and record keeping, including the counterparty identification part of the originally proposed CTR requirement.
Right. Which was the part that we really objected to.
Yeah.
And so at this point, we are very optimistic that now that it's clear that FinCEN is thinking about this rule sort of in 2 tracks, the CTR piece and then the counterparty piece. And now that we've got 60 more days for everything, when this is all over and done, we're optimistic that the counterparty stuff is kind of just put aside. Like, that's not something that I think Treasury really wants to pursue at this point. And it's the counterparty piece is what all of the 7,000 comments that they received in the first round were addressed at, right?
And our comments. So we made, we made some arguments about process and statutory authority that were in general, especially about the rushed process of the original notice and comment, and what seems to be rushed legal reasoning as to how they were grounding it in the Bank Secrecy Act. Those apply to everything. But now that we've gotten a more regularized process and new statutory authority cited in the NDAA, that stuff's moot. The arguments we were making about the substance were all about the counterparty thing exclusively. Right. And that includes the constitutional law arguments. So if there was not a counterparty identification requirement here, it would be difficult to come up with Fourth Amendment or First Amendment free assembly, donations to nonprofit type arguments that just the CTR requirement on its own is somehow unconstitutional. It'd be very, very hard to come up with those. Whereas back when we were talking about the counterparty stuff, it was like, okay, well, Coin Center is going to set up and has actually some self-custodied, I hate using these terms, so some Bitcoin addresses that we control, and people are going to donate to us. And the counterparty rule would say, financial institutions need to know all the people that are donating to Coin Center and report that for transactions over $10,000. And they'd be compiling a list of our donors. And then we'd argue that, according to old Supreme Court precedent, you can't force nonprofits to divulge lists of their memberships, and that violates First Amendment rights to free assembly. But we can't make those arguments merely about currency transaction reports, which are just the financial institution says, hey, my customer moved more than $10,000. I don't know what happened after it.
Right. And but I think the fact that we and others explained how pernicious counterparty identification would be, and the fact that it seems that Secretary Mnuchin was a driving force behind wanting that, and he is now gone, I think all that is, again, going to lead FinCEN hopefully to kind of put that aside and focus on the CTR piece. And the CTR piece is the piece that we did not address at all in our comments, and I think most people did not address in their comments. And so now we've got 60 days, and we probably will be filing again. And I think what FinCEN would want is comments related to that CTR piece that went kind of unaddressed before.
Do we have much to say, though?
Yeah. So I think for industry who is going to have to comply with this rule, they should look very carefully at the rulemaking and what amendments they're making, FinCEN is proposing to make to the forms that they're going to have to, right? So what exactly is in the cash transaction report, right? Does it include a transaction hash ID? Does it include, I have no idea, right? So these are things that firms and compliance folks need to make sure all make sense. But from our perspective as a nonprofit that doesn't represent industry, but represents users of the technology and developers of the technology and the technology itself, I'm not sure we have a whole lot to say.
No, from a public policy standpoint, is assuming that the sort of bespoke new transaction report for $10,000 more crypto moving is relatively similar to the existing cash transaction report. It's hard to get too upset over just equal treatment with what banks already have to do when their customers withdraw cash. You can get a little upset because it's one of these markers of how much we've accepted the surveillance state in this country since the 1970s, that all of this data just gets reported to the government without a warrant. But again, we're not going to necessarily start an armed rebellion
as it were
against the Bank Secrecy Act that would affect the entire financial ecosystem writ large. We're just interested in crypto, and we're just interested in crypto being treated equally as,
or no worse off than anything else.
Moving through traditional financial institutions.
Right. We want no worse treatment than anything else that FinCEN regulates.
I will say for the wonky compliance people who need to look carefully at what the proposed form will ultimately include as far as data. It's worth noting that they're not doing this in a purely technologically neutral way. They're creating a bespoke and different virtual currency transaction report, if you will, aside from the normal cash transaction report. And the reason for that isn't, I think, in this case, a desire to create differential standards for different technologies, which would be bad, which we would argue against. It's that if you simply added cryptocurrencies and stablecoins and things, because they're covering that too, it's worth noting, to the definition of monetary instruments that exists in the Code of Federal Regulations as a definition of monetary instruments. That would be the totally tech neutral way to apply new enhanced reporting requirements for customers moving crypto. But it would have a lot of collateral consequences because that term monetary instruments is used throughout the implementing regulations of the Bank Secrecy Act. And if they just and they're not doing this, but if they just simply added crypto to that definition, there'd be like very odd situations where if you're at the border going from the US to Mexico, technically, if crypto is a monetary instrument, you need to declare moving $10,000 or more at the border. Right. And is it a brain wallet? Are they going to have like a CT scanner? What's going to happen? So it's good that we're not just seeing FinCEN propose to add this to the definition of monetary instruments, and instead saying we're going to require some special reports from financial institutions for transactions over $10,000 that are similar to reports on monetary instruments, but we're not adding crypto to the definition of monetary instruments. So, if you're really interested in exactly how they're writing these new regs and how if you're a compliance person at a company, note that it's not being added to the definition. There's just a new special report being created for these transactions. And then, yes, give input as to what you think is reasonable and not privacy invasive or not difficult to comply with as far as information that could be in the fields that you as a regulated financial institution would need to fill out whenever your customer transacts over $10,000.
All right. So I think that's all we have to say about, which is mercifully the only thing we have to say about FinCEN at this point, since it's consumed our lives for past couple months.
I think it's worth not being too, not letting our guard down too much.
Yeah.
Because, We've been watching for a long time in Europe, and you can watch in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, in Singapore, and some general rumblings coming out of the Financial Action Task Force, which is the global body that sets standards in anti-money laundering, recording, and reporting. We've been watching as a lot of jurisdictions have gone in the direction of requiring deep identification of all of the incoming and outgoing transactions for exchanges. And so that's not dead. And, the US influences FATF and FATF influences the US. So it could come back, right, Jerry?
Oh, 100%. And, the new administration just took office, and maybe in this rulemaking, the only thing that comes out of it is the CTR, and that would be good. But they're not going to stop there, right? They're going to, crypto is going to continue to be a challenge, especially for folks interested in curbing terrorist financing. And they're always going to want to have more and more information, which is funny, right? Because something you have to understand, I think sometimes people don't understand, is that especially in Western countries, there is a division between the policymaking body related to terrorist financing and anti-money laundering and the and law enforcement and financial intelligence units like FinCEN, where the maybe more political, maybe more wonkish policymaking arm always wants more information and always wants more regulation. And the people who then have to deal with that more information are like, what are we doing with this? This is all just noise.
Yeah. They have to deal with all that additional information, and they have to deal with their counterparties, the regulated institutions, starting to be wary because the demands on them are being increased from the policy perspective. and it can break down the relationship that is an important relationship between law enforcement and the regulated financial sector. Yeah.
Right. So without knowing still what the final outlines of what the Biden Treasury Department will be, we don't know. It could be that we are back where we started, in a year's time on these things.
And I think one last thing I wanted to point out on this for this week is it's important to always remember, for the wonkish compliance people, they know this, but for people who are thinking about the obligations of financial institutions, we already have this these OFAC rules, which say that if you're an individual, you're supposed to have some ability to find out who you're paying and not pay people on the SDN list and not pay people who might be in Iran or wherever in sanctioned nations. And so we are fighting this counterparty identification rule that says you need to have a name and physical address for your customer's customer all the time, and you need to record that, and in many cases report that to government. We're fighting that because it's a black letter requirement to collect a lot of information that's privacy invasive and share it with government, even for innocent parties, even for people who aren't on the SDN list, who are just normal Americans who are doing normal transactions, and this shouldn't be swept up in a dragnet. But if we don't have a counterparty identification requirement that's strict and sweeps up all that information, there's still a risk-based requirement to not pay people on the sanctions list. And so, exchanges are still going to have to do a lot of due diligence as far as figuring out who their customers are paying, and they already do. It's just important that be part of their risk-based standards. They can come up with their own procedures to figure out when they feel like they need to have extra information. They shouldn't be dictated that you always need to have this exact extra information and it always needs to be reported straight to government in all these situations. There's a lot of nuance still to what kind of record keeping will be done at exchanges. We're just gratified that it seems like, and this is not a done deal, there won't be this very privacy invasive, information security vulnerable black letter requirement to record a name and physical address for every Bitcoin address that your customer is sending money to, or something like that.
Right. Okay, so now truly wrapping up that topic.
We need little theme music snippets.
Yeah, FinCEN talk. So let's switch gears and talk a little DeFi. And DeFi has, obviously been getting a lot of attention over the past year. A lot of exciting, interesting experiments coming up. But I think related to the Wall Street bets GameStop saga, which we won't recount here because surely if you're listening to this, you know everything.
Hopefully sick of it like we are.
I'm not. You said you're sick of it. I find it's fascinating to me. You've had your fill.
It is an extreme version of everything the internet has been promising and delivering so far, and I feel just as conflicted about it as I do everything else so far.
Yes, it is conflicting.
I like that some people have pointed out in a few different places that Martin Gurry, who we had on Tangents, the podcast a while ago, kind of like predicted this. And I was talking with Adam, his son, and Adam was like, my dad's a little freaked out about that because he's like, I'm not an expert in finance. I don't know anything about options trading.
No, yeah,
but it's true that like just as a general thesis of, what the internet does when there are people in power benefiting and they feel that is arbitrary and worth taking down, like it's kind of what's happening, right?
Yeah, there are people. So there are people who, for a long time have benefited from scarcity to access of some kind or another. And the internet comes along and it opens up access and it opens up spontaneous coordination in a way that was never possible before. And that, slowly but surely has been taking down these centralized scarce access points by mobs, essentially. And these mobs, what Martin Gurry points out is that these mobs are mobs because they don't have any, people kind of in retrospect rationalize them.
But they don't stand for anything.
They don't stand for anything.
They don't believe in GameStop.
There is,
I believe in screwing the people who don't believe in GameStop.
Not even that. I don't think you can say that. I think, no, they just believe in. So there is a meme that I saved because I want to print this out and put it. It's the frog with the scorpion on top.
Oh, yeah.
And the frog says, "But if we crash the economy, we'll both drown," said the frog. And then it says, "Lol," said the scorpion, LMAO. Right? So
we are nihilists, Lebowski. We believe in nothing.
I really think it's I think there are multitudes of motivations within the group. So I don't think you can say it's any one thing. We both different in, but I think, as Guri says, if there's anything that's unifying, it's negation. Right? It's just taking them down.
I disagree, Jerry.
No, you're wrong. But with the Wall Street bet stuff, I think it's drawn a lot of attention to DeFi because people have been pointing to, well, look, this wouldn't have happened if you'd have trading on DeFi where you had instant settlement and everything was atomic and blah, blah, blah.
Now, I've seen Niraj question this narrative, though. Like, this is a narrative that DeFi people want, right? Whereas the Wall Street bets people are like, who cares?
What do you mean?
What, like, Niraj had a good tweet where he said, like everyone's expecting them to now pile into Bitcoin and things.
Oh,
because,
right.
like, they believe, the centralization is a problem. It stops us from being the mob we want to be. So let's do decentralization. But then they just buy Dogecoin, you know, right. And it's not serious. It's still just for the lulls. And is it really about DeFi now, or is it just about?
No. I don't think the mob cares much, right, about any of these things. But to the extent that this episode revealed anything, right? What it revealed are some of the consequences. Some people might say they're good consequences, quite frankly, of the centralized T+2 DTCC run model that we use.
Well, even if some of the consequences are positive, it's another thing that gives you a lot of pause and makes you uneasy. In the same way that, like, in the insanity that happened here in DC in the transition of power, there was suddenly this breaking point for a lot of communications intermediaries where they said, okay, we're gonna start aggressively taking people off our platform, even if they're the sitting president or any number of other people. And you're like, well, maybe, I don't know if that was the right thing or not, but it does reveal one thing, that there's a crazy amount of power in that, and arbitrary power. Like, this is not the rule of law. There's no court. Like, Facebook has a ridiculous fake court for determining when they deplatform people, right? But that's not the rule of law. That's arbitrary power. Mm-hmm. And what the GameStop thing has revealed is, okay, well, one of these retail stock trading intermediaries is like, okay, well, we'll just allow people to buy or to sell, but not buy this stock and this stock. And it's like, whoa, that's pretty arbitrary and that's pretty powerful and might be for the right reasons, but
they might have had no choice. Yep, I think that's right. And a quick digression to kind of highlight your point. Wall Street Bets was kicked off Discord.
Yeah. Right.
Which we should disclose. We know somebody on the Discord on the how should we say, the relatively new trust and safety team at Discord. So I would love to hear from them what that was like. But they kicked off Wall Street Bets kicked off their Discord server, not for anything related to the claim was that there was
hate speech in there.
Hate speech.
And I mean, there's probably hate speech in almost every Discord server.
I think that's right.
And then you ban that person and you remove them. You don't shut the whole thing down.
And it's not just that. It's that it seems to me that there probably was hate speech for years, and it was now.
It's bad timing.
It's so anyhow. Yeah. A digression. So look. So yeah, I agree. I don't think people are going to be piling over to DeFi, but what happened with GameStop, Robinhood, Wall Street Bets does reveal certain things that maybe people weren't aware of. And DeFi seems to be at least one way that you could address it. I noted today that SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce gave an interview about DeFi, and this is something she said that I thought was interesting. She said, quote, "It's going to be challenging to us because most of the way we regulate is through intermediaries. And when you really build something that's decentralized, there's no intermediary." Mm-hmm. And then she goes on, "It's great for resilience of a system, but it's much harder for us when we're trying to go in and regulate to figure out how to do that." So I thought we'd talk a little bit about what's our take on the intersection of DeFi and regulation. And I think sort of a key word that I should have highlighted when I tweeted it out is when she says, when you really build something that's decentralized.
Yeah.
So anyway, how do we think about DeFi and regulation, Peter?
So, you asked me this earlier today, like, should we put out some new material? And my response was, well, we wrote this, it was an op-ed, right? It was published in...
Yeah, in The Block or Decrypt.
The Block, I think.
Yeah, The Block, yeah. It's on our website now.
There's no such thing as a decentralized exchange. I was constantly kind of battling over whether I like this title or not. It definitely is the kind of title that
you click on,
gets attention. So I guess it's good for that reason. All the bad incentives of the internet and journalism reveal themselves. And the point of that piece was in the narrow topic of decentralized exchange, which is certainly, I think everyone would agree, a subgenre, if you will, of decentralized finance. It's, the exchange part of all the things you might want to do in a decentralized way with money. We say, look, people have gotten into this bad habit. It's you understand why, of saying, oh, I used a decentralized exchange, like you would say, I used a national securities exchange, like NASDAQ or something, or I used a Coinbase, I used a cryptocurrency exchange. And decentralized exchange, if it really is decentralized, is not a noun like Coinbase or the New York Stock Exchange. It is a verb. It's something that two people do, and there's just these two people doing it, the decentralized exchange. And what's in between them, if it really is decentralized in the way that Commissioner Peirce is saying in certain situations it might be one day, is software that's released on an open source basis for anybody to use for any number of purposes, maybe for exchange of certain things, but maybe for other things as well. And apart from software, there's these permissionless networks, which are just, people keeping data on the internet, and they don't really look into or know much about all of the details of what's in that data. Like, if you validate transactions in the Bitcoin blockchain, you're just checking digital signatures. You have no idea that this is a transaction from Jerry to Peter, or this is a smart contract in the case of, say, more likely Ethereum for smart contracts. When you validate an Ethereum block, you don't know that like these transactions are all related to this particularly popular way of doing decentralized exchange. Now, on the other hand, and the reason why we say there's no such thing as a decentralized exchange, if a decentralized exchange has branding and marketing and a front-end website and people making claims about it, and people who maybe develop the software but have done other things apart from developing the software, like they take fees per transaction, or they issue a token that's necessary in order to use the decentralized exchange, then you're in a world of all of these, it's hard to deny, centralized activities that people are performing that build up and make the decentralized exchange possible. And those centralized activities are more likely going to be the things that people will try and maybe even succeed at regulating.
And it's interesting because the SEC is in a little bit, or regulators generally, are still in a bit of a bind, because even if they successfully, let's say, enforce existing regulations against these parties.
Mhm.
And they shut them down completely. Technically, the decentralized exchange platform or protocol can continue to operate.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a thing I always point out when people want to talk about, say, the SEC's response to decentralized exchange is, well, I said, well, first, look, they've already done something here 2 years ago now, almost.
Yeah.
They brought an action against Ether
Delta,
and not against Ether Delta per se, but against the developer of that.
The original. So at the time that the enforcement action was brought, they brought it against a person who developed and operated it for a while and then sold it to a foreign firm. So they brought the investment action against that person after it had been sold.
After it already been sold. And Ether Delta is not still running to this day, which is something I used to say.
No, the smart contract is running.
Yeah. But nobody uses it anymore because it's sort of defunct and broken and there's no liquidity. Last I checked.
But people still use. I checked recently, and they do. It's been used recently. There's not the kind of volume that you see on other type smart contracts, but my point being,
you can bring a charges against and settle, which they did with a person who developed something. In this case, it was Zachary Coburn. I had to look it up because I have a terrible memory for these things. But the thing that's on the Ethereum blockchain and is just software can live on and will live on, and that's a problem. Then you've not achieved the policy result you want, right?
And you can imagine a case where a anonymous group of volunteer developers picks it up and continues to develop it,
right? And then overzealous enforcement, or sort of the approach that the record industry took to policing copyright law by bringing big visible actions against the few people they could catch, is only likely to lead people to sort of re-architect and refigure how they do these things so that they won't be the ones caught, right?
Yeah, I think
pushes the stuff further underground, which is maybe inevitable, but
right. So, and this is kind of, we don't give advice. We're not anybody's lawyers, but we, when asked on panels and such, back when we were talking a lot more about ICOs and the like, back in 2017, 2018, right? When we would go on panels and discuss this, something that I would say, and I think you would agree with me, Peter, is if you want to develop a new cryptocurrency network, the best thing for you to do is to do what Satoshi did, which is write the software, publish it, and then leave. Get out of the way and let it take off. Now, clearly, there's very little money in that. I mean, I guess there's money in that if you are one of the miners, and since you believe in your thing, you're going to be one of the early miners. And so if the thing takes off, you'll do well.
Realistically, that worked for Satoshi because it was easy to be one of the miners in a world where mining is not a commoditized massive industry yet.
Right.
Whereas, if you were using any common proof of work algorithm, you'll be immediately outcompeted by people all over the world, and you won't make any money off of this protocol you developed.
Right.
And everybody now also wants to make proof of stake things or other new consensus models. And how can you have a proof of stake cryptocurrency without a pre-mine, which immediately creates some jeopardy of securities regulation, because who do you give the pre-mine to?
Right.
Investors, yourself, are you enriching yourself, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So but you're right. The best thing to do is just to write software and not do other things.
Of course, you have all these other considerations, which is why I'm completely sympathetic, and I understand the position that folks find themselves when they're trying to develop a new platform, a new network. But again, if what you're trying to maximize for is avoiding any kind of securities violation whatsoever, that's what you want to do. You want to release software and get out of the way. So where was I going with this? That it reminds me of that, right? Because now you have people who are developing, as you say, they're developing protocols for decentralized finance and for different kinds of decentralized financial transactions. And the best bet would be to just develop and publish software. It's very difficult to do that because it's not cheap, right? It's not costless to spend time developing this stuff. But that would be the best way.
And who are your users ultimately going to be? There's some people who are going to be out there happy to wait for a GitHub repository to fill up with open source code and then run it themselves to instantiate on the Ethereum blockchain if it's not there already, and then use the command line to interact with the Ethereum blockchain to actually trade. That's a handful of people. Yeah. The successful decentralized exchanges and activity, or the widespread one, will be the one that is branded as a noun and
has a good user interface.
Has a good user interface, which means until we get more decentralized storage like Saga or Filecoin, and until we have decentralized DNS, and even then it'll still be easier to just use traditional AWS and a regular DNS registry. And those are choke points, and those are things you're now doing beyond writing software, right?
And even then, I think that if there's one thing that open source development has never cracked, it is design. And so, so the UX design is something that, and we could dedicate.
There's some Linux fanboys listening to us right now. Like, I know you're wrong. The Unity desktop environment is vastly superior. I've tiled all of my windows right now in a 32 by 32 matrix, and I can see everything.
Okay, so what I would say though, again, when we're talking about building a new cryptocurrency network, so if you want to be sure that you're completely avoiding any kind of securities liability, is to publish software, get out of the way. If you can't do that, right, then there are other things you can do, right? And so and by the way, I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the way Grin did it, right? So it's not like it's impossible that only Satoshi could have done it. I think Grin may have done that. Fact check me, people, if I'm wrong.
For issuing a new
network
protocol and not having a pre-mine, but doing something else to.
They simply
raise
published software. No, they didn't raise any money, as far as I'm aware. They just published it and people ran it.
Okay, right. You said there's something else though.
Oh, sorry. I'm just saying that's one model. It's a Satoshi model, which I think Grin did. Then what else can you do? Well, you can do what Zcash did, right? Which is create a founder's reward. You could do what some have done with staffs. So you register for a Reg D exemption with the SEC. You could do a Reg A plus like Stacks did. And the jury is still kind of out, I think, still, honestly, on these. But I think if you do everything by the book and you really, at the end of the day, produce a decentralized network, you're probably okay. I think something like Commissioner Peirce's proposed safe harbor that would give you more certainty, would give you some breathing room, some 3 years in her proposed safe harbor to be sure that by the end of it, you've got to be completely decentralized. So that's good.
But now we're talking about,
and so I'm trying to draw parallels. Is what I'm doing. Yeah. So that's for that. So my question is, what can you do if you can't just, if you're not in a position to simply write the software and walk away in the DeFi space? And this is, I think, where we are now, right? Is in the same spot where we were with the SEC, trying to get clarity, quote unquote. We need more, quote unquote, clarity about when you're decentralized. How do you go about it? I think that's where we are with DeFi now.
And maybe to be clear for the audience, maybe I'm just being pedantic, but so there's sort of two laws you shouldn't break with respect to securities laws that we're discussing, and the token issuance stuff and the approaches that maybe you could take where you would no longer be violating token issuance laws that are implicated by token issuance laws is about issuing securities and doing it in an unregistered fashion, which is a crime. And the arguments there are, of course, well, there are certain ways to create cryptocurrencies that you have a very good faith argument would not fit into the definition of securities, and therefore it's not securities issuance. But if you can't do that, i.e. just release software like Satoshi did, and then there's a very poor argument that anything in regards to Bitcoin is a security, you might be able to find a way to comply with securities laws up to the point where the thing is decentralized such that it's not a security. And that's like doing a Reg A or Reg D or things like that. The other set of laws that you shouldn't break with respect to securities laws when you're doing things with crypto is about exchange. So the Securities Exchange Act, is that 34? I don't know. I get them confused. Clearly says look, securities when trading for the general public the trades should occur on a market, and the market needs to be registered. So the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, and there are also these things called alternative trading systems, ATSs, which is another way where you don't have to qualify as a national security exchange, but you still have to register and qualify. These are heavy-duty regulations for securities intermediaries. So if you're building a smart contract that replaces securities intermediaries, at what point are you yourself a securities intermediary? And if you're not registering as National Securities Exchange, are you violating those laws? And are there ways to, like you would with a token sale, comply with those laws if it's not decentralized? Or do you just have to be fully decentralized, at which point you shouldn't be doing things that would enrich you probably, or things like that? So what's the middle ground is the question about those intermediary regulation areas as opposed to issuing regulation areas.
Right. And so as a baseline, I think to the extent that there is a centralized front end that you're providing to the smart contract, right? Anybody can come to the smart contract on a command line, as you say, and trade any two tokens. But to the extent that you're facilitating things by providing a centralized front end, and certainly if you are profiting from that, you should not be listing anything that's a security.
Right. Because if the only things trading on it are, in theory, not securities, like it's Bitcoin and Ether, although these things are usually all within one ecosystem, like Ether tokens for Ether tokens. But if it's just Bitcoin and Ether, that's not securities exchange. That's just commodities exchange and retail commodities exchange, which isn't even directly supervised by the CFTC. They police for manipulation. They don't register commodities trading houses that are doing retail commodities transactions, just derivatives. So that's okay. So you shouldn't be, if you're running the front end for a decentralized exchange, you definitely should not be saying come to my website and you can trade Tesla tokenized, something like that, which I've seen, by the way.
We should talk about that. So that's one thing. And then it kind of gets hazy from there, right? This is the piece where I think, Hester Peirce is getting at. They're going to have to develop more clarity. And so one thing that we've looked at are some opinions from the SEC from the 90s, just as the internet was starting, related to bulletin board services that provided matchmaking. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah. So, at its heart, when you're helping two people connect to trade, you're mostly providing just communication services, right? This is not like how we talk about in the money transmission context, where you're taking custody of the money and having.
You might be.
And you might be. You might have custody of the underlying securities,
but you don't have to be, right? And probably most of the value of what you provide is the matchmaking services that you bring people together, especially when they're market makers. And there's discovery of others and discoveries of the price that people are willing to trade at. But then the trade itself can happen between the two people.
Right. So back in the 90s, when we had this explosion of new communications tools, it's of course obvious that several people set up bulletin boards where people could find each other and make offers and ultimately settle off of the platform. And the question is, are those internet bulletin boards of the 90s effectively securities exchanges then? Right. And it's kind of a hard question, because the definition of national securities exchange in the securities laws is extremely broad. I don't have it in front of me, but it's basically, it reaches things like facilitating people coming together and finding matches for their trades and things like that.
Right. And this is, these were literally bulletin boards, the kind that you would go to post classifieds or like Craigslist. And the things that we're trading on here, probably, I think we'd have to go back and look, but I'm pretty certain were not things like shares of IBM, because they're better venues for that. These were shares of illiquid companies. And also the people who put up these forums made money because they would charge you to have access to it. And so some of them asked the SEC, hey, can you give us some clarity?
Yep. And so the SEC did offer some no action relief to some bulletin board maintainers. And the question is, would someone who's developing a decentralized exchange today and does want to do some centralized activities related to it, maintain a front end, do some branding of it in order to make it more user friendly, have a good user interface, could they apply for similar no action relief as the bulletin board maintainers of the 90s? And that is a huge open question. It's certainly something that like big securities law firms who are like ogling DeFi money are probably really like hoping to make a name for. Like the first person to get this no action letter from the SEC, if they succeed, as a lawyer or as a law firm, will have made a good reputation for themselves in the space. And it's a hard question. So in some of these no action letters about bulletin boards, there's sort of enumerated lists of things that the entity who achieved no action or sought no action was and was not doing. And one of the things that was most interesting to me, we won't go into too much detail about those lists, is if you're making money off of maintenance of the bulletin board, it's as a sort of flat fee for membership to the bulletin board that people who want to be members of the bulletin board pay, not a per transaction fee and nothing to do with the amount transacted. And so that on its own seems to me to be sort of a red flag or something worth pointing out. If you're seeking no action, most of the DeFi models that I've seen are a per transaction fee, and might even be some percentage of the amount being exchanged. That might, there's no hard and fast rule here. The SEC could grant no action in a different way than they've granted no action before, or they could refuse to grant no action altogether. But it is interesting that's one thing to point out about the bulletin board no action letters, is that general flat membership fees seem to be okay back then, but per transaction fees maybe not.
Right. Okay. So anyhow, this is something where we're just going to have to watch and wait to see what the SEC does, if anything. I think, just so folks understand clearly what our position is, we care about truly decentralized networks, and we care, kind of almost exclusively about people's rights to publish and run software. And so, to the extent that the SEC does anything to impinge those rights, that would definitely draw our attention. But when you move more towards basically centralized efforts, it falls kind of outside of what we focus on. What else was I going to say about this? I think that's it.
Could talk about First Amendment stuff.
Yeah. Well, we should explain why we care about it.
Yeah, the backstop that should be the line that regulation doesn't pass is always publication of open source software,
right?
Because
and by the way, the reason it's not crazy to think that they would predicate some kind of enforcement action based solely on publishing. In the Ether Delta case, again, there was no case; there was just a settlement. And in the settlement, and I think in the sort of note accompanying the settlement, right, the press release, you could say, the SEC said that they would continue to go after individuals and firms who were doing stuff even if they called it decentralized, and they gave a list of things that you were not allowed to do, and one of them was developing algorithms.
And it's like developing or providing algorithms. Right. And an algorithm is a fancy word for just some zeros and ones in a particular arrangement.
Yeah. So if this and that. And so, we at that time reached out to the SEC and communicated how that would not be.
Well, I think, and to give the SEC credit, it was unclear in that statement whether they meant doing that as well as maintaining a website and promoting the website as a place to trade securities and other things, or do they mean that you would just need to do one of these several things and one of them providing algorithms? Because if it's just providing algorithms that triggers liability, then you get into this pretty deep and gnarly question of, all right, when are the regulations effectively an unconstitutional prior restraint on free expression or First Amendment rights? And
so, we made it clear to them that predicating a violation on speech alone would not be constitutional. It was a good constructive conversation. I would note that the EFF sent a letter publicly, being maybe a bit more pointed than Coin Center, which is great. Always to be good call back up that way. But part of the reason it's so important to us, and the reason it's important to us, is because that's what allows somebody to do the first option that I pointed out: write the software, publish it, and get out of the way. Right. And that is just speech. That cannot be ever the source of a violation. I think, Peter, you and I agree that DeFi, clearly, as there's more activity there, is going to get more attention from the SEC, and that if I was a betting man, and I wanted to go on a prediction market, I would say that the people at the SEC are as acutely aware of the challenges, Hester Peirce is pointing out, of regulating these things as national securities markets as we are. And so if they have an opportunity to avoid taking on that issue, they will. And that might present itself if there's a much clearer violation. So if part of a DeFi platform, there was a token issuance that's maybe more clearly a securities violation, that's, I think, where the SEC will focus.
Yeah, I think it's right. It's easier for the SEC to come after you for issuing an unregistered security. Because
then having to make speech arguments,
the DAO and things like that, you don't have to worry about making fighting free speech arguments to the same extent. And so, it's unfortunate to say, but there's low hanging fruit then in the DeFi space, because most of these projects have tokens that have been issued, and several of them, there might be a credible argument that the tokens that were issued are effectively securities, under the broad standard of the Howey test.
So before we go, I wanted to talk about, like you, I've seen advertisements and media stories about basically the stocks that were kicked off of Robinhood now be traded on both centralized and decentralized platforms.
Tokenized versions of them, right?
Tokenized GameStop, tokenized Nokia.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, I want to get your thoughts. So the centralized version I've seen is there is an underlying stock that's being held by a custodian, and then on behalf of the exchange, and then the exchange, basically tokenizes and lets people trade these. On the decentralized side, and maybe even on the centralized side, I've also seen what are called synthetic securities, or whatever they're called.
Well, one might call them a derivative of a security trade.
Synthetic derivatives. So I don't know. You want to give us a quick sketch?
Really? I mean, if it's nakedly the equity of a corporation and it's tokenized, it doesn't somehow magically not become a security any longer. And so, I mean, there might be enforcement issues here as to how to track down the people who are actually facilitating this activity, whether they're in the centralized context.
So the exchange that I saw, the centralized exchange that I saw doing this, basically did not allow U.S. persons
Right.
trade. And
but that's hard.
That is hard.
That it's like, how tenable is that? Are you checking IP addresses, or what do you do?
They probably are. They probably are.
But a VPN gets around that. How many Americans are going to use a VPN, get around that, and buy these things? Yeah. Basically, there's two people I wouldn't want to be right now. I don't want to be the lawyer who has to come up with an argument for these people as to why that's not, facilitating unregistered securities trading or unregistered securities exchange. And I don't want to be Gary Gensler either, who, God bless him. We talked about him in a previous episode about how,
incoming chair of the SEC.
Yeah, incoming chairman of the SEC, probably neither a big negative downside risk for the crypto space,
nor a booster.
He knows about this stuff. He knows this tech, and he's sharp and good at his job. But this is not what I expected the first fire drill to be about for an incoming SEC chairman, just as probably former chairman Jay Clayton didn't expect ICOs to be the first fire drill.
Right.
So it's going to be an interesting season.
But I can imagine the platforms that are offering that kind of asset drawing sort of the most initial attention.
I mean, these are the ones that they're going to be stories in the New York Times written about, because the people find the GameStop stuff fascinating, and it is pretty fascinating. And this is also huge as far as amounts of money involved, and it's a lot like the ICO craze of 2017.
Yeah. Okay, I think we'll leave it there. Come back next time for some more.
At the end of these, I always have this moment where I'm like, did I say something I shouldn't have said? Did we tread that line?
This
all
is
right?
Good. This is what's going to keep people coming back.
Yeah.
All right. See you next time, Peter.
Bye, Jerry.